just want to welcome everyone. My name is Russ Carnahan. I am chairman and co-founder with Andrew Goldberg of BuildingAction, the Coalition for Sustainable Buildings. And we're really thrilled to be doing this virtual event today on recovery and rebuilding, blueprint for sustainable building policy in 2021. And I wanted to give a special shout out and thanks also to Mir Mustafa on our board and Ben Finzel with Renew PR, all of our members and allies that have been part of creating BuildingAction, which is now a year-old organization. And you can check out our website at buildingaction.org and see our 2020 first annual report and many of the things we have planned for next year. But with that, I really want to welcome our moderator today. We could not be more pleased to have Abby Smith. She is a well-known reporter, gives a lot of great insight at the Washington Examiner, their daily energy report. She's covered climate and policy in the EPA for Bloomberg previously, and is a really important voice in covering energy policy developments in Washington. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Abby. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ, and thanks everyone for tuning in this afternoon. I know it's especially tricky after the lunch hour where everyone's feeling a little bit groggy, but you've come to the right place because we're about to have a pretty lively discussion about sustainable building policy. So, and it couldn't be more timely. We've got a new Congress with Democratic control, but slim margins, meaning we're likely to see climate discussions, but also a push for lawmakers to work across the aisle. And then next week, we'll see President-elect Biden sworn into office, bringing with him the most ambitious climate agenda of any president. Buildings where we live and work every day are significant emitters and will be an important piece of his agenda as he's tackling those emissions. We've got a great panel of experts here to share some insights. We're joined by Dan Riker, a senior research scholar at Stanford University, former Assistant Secretary of Energy, former Director of Climate and Energy Initiatives at Google, and a leader of the group Clean Energy for Biden. He's also advised the Biden campaign on clean energy and climate issues. Welcome, Dan. To give us a business perspective, we're joined by Larry Williams, Executive Director of the Steel Framing Industry Association. The group represents steel and building construction with members throughout the entire supply chain. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Russ Carnahan, who you have already met, former Democratic Congressman from Missouri's 3rd District and co-founder of BuildingAction. So we will leave some time at the end for questions from the audience, so please feel free throughout the discussion to pop those into the Q&A box. We will be monitoring that. And if you feel comfortable, please do include your name and your affiliation. We'd love to know who we're receiving questions from and who we're discussing this with. And I'll ask panelists to weigh in on those questions later in the hour. So let's jump right into the discussion. I think one of the big questions on everyone's mind, given how close we are to Inauguration Day, is what should we expect from the Biden administration? So, Dan, starting with you, can you walk us through what President-elect Biden has promised in his climate plans on building policy?
First of all, Abby, thank you. It's great to be with you. This is a very timely event, and buildings are obviously key to where we're headed on energy and climate. So pleased to be here with you. Excuse me. So in terms of the president-elect, soon to be the president, he started with a very big commitment just in terms of funding, $2 trillion in his first term, investing overall in clean energy, reforming, extending tax incentives, adopting a energy efficiency and clean energy standard, a national standard. He talked about that. And with specific reference to buildings, upgrading 4 million commercial buildings, weatherizing 2 million US homes, cutting the energy use of our national building stock in half by 2035. A big push to modernize the nation's schools, including how they use energy, and spurring construction of 1.5 million efficient and affordable homes and public housing. So that's just a piece of what he's talked about it. So it's a big agenda, but I think it's an exciting one, and I think it's a realistic one, and I think it gives us a good goal to shoot for.
And to follow up there, inauguration day, the rumor is we're likely to see at least a statement from then President Biden, maybe even some executive action or executive orders on day one. Do you anticipate that buildings policy, some of the policies you just mentioned, might be incorporated in that, and we might start to see some direction from the president and his administration on this issue?
Well, I think we're going to see some direction pretty quickly. In terms of the first day, I think the big one will, of course, likely be re-entering the Paris Climate Agreement. And obviously, the U.S. re-entering that requires that we do more, do better when it comes to energy use of all sorts, particularly in buildings. So I think that's going to give us a good launch pad for that. As far as the specific sorts of things he's put together, I think that's all being put together. He's got a team in the White House that recently has been announced. We know who the cabinet secretaries are going to be. And so I think maybe not day one, but the first 100 days, I think a lot of these key elements of a much more effective building energy policy are going to emerge.
Definitely. So Larry, I want to bring you in here. Can you talk to us a little bit about your industry and your members, and also what you would like to see from the Biden administration on sustainable building policies? What are some of your priorities going into this new administration?
Yeah, thank you, Abby, and thanks everybody for an opportunity to come and be with you today and talk about this. I mean, this really is kind of an exciting time, and we see kind of a world of real possibilities ahead of us. I think maybe just to kind of set a tone, I think sometimes the impression from some others who may not necessarily be in the construction or the corporate world, in terms of those of us who really think very hardly about the profit and loss side, is that we try to push off as much regulation as possible, or try to, especially resistant to sustainability and energy. But I think that's hopefully to change a little bit of the mindset. In fact, those of us, who are in industry and looking at the bottom line, see a real value and in some cases, a real priority toward lowering the energy use, lowering the impact. It's got obviously it's a good positive impact on the environment, but when you're using less energy, you're lowering your costs. It represents the fact that you are much more efficient in your operations and therefore doing better. And, in this highly competitive world, we are continually focused on making sure that those improvements that we make day to day, are consistent, and we continue to move toward the more efficient ways of doing things. And it really also incorporates the environment and sustainability. It's not a separate issue. It's actually part of the discussion, and it has been, let's say, just speaking to the steel industry for quite a while, and you can kind of see it show up in terms of the reduction of energy use, adoption of new technologies that are more efficient, phasing out of old technologies that have probably, you would associate with some of the smokestack perceptions of steel and some other industries. And I think in comparison, we were even 10 years ago, are light years ahead, and you'll see that continue. Now, looking in terms of the priorities for what we would hope to see, in this year, hopefully starting this year in a real way, is looking at what needs to happen in this country relative to infrastructure. Infrastructure is something that's been on the talking agenda for a number of years, but I think it's really, every year that goes on, it becomes increasingly urgent that something concrete, if you will, needs to be done on the subject of infrastructure. We have bridges and roads that are failing, becoming unusable. When the infrastructure isn't in the best condition, it does have an impact on cost, time frames, all sorts of things that, in the end of the day, either have a negative impact on business, have a negative impact on the consumers, but because of some of the inefficiencies that a declining infrastructure represents, also has a negative impact on our environmental footprint. So we think that that's a a critical issue that we hope is a priority. I think that there's an opportunity for everybody to come together on something, because really there is a benefit across entire society from doing something meaningful on infrastructure.
For sure, and that's a great point, and definitely infrastructure seems to be on a lot of people's minds these days. We're definitely going to get into that in a second, but first I want to bring in Russ here and think about from a Capitol Hill perspective. When we think about energy efficiency in buildings, we did see some significant progress made last year in the bipartisan energy package that was included in year-end spending legislation. But not all of that made it into the big energy bill. A significant piece was left behind. So I wanted to ask you what you think we should expect from Congress on building efficiency. Can we build on what was passed last Congress, and what are your prospects for bipartisan progress on this issue? I think you might be muted. There you go.
Helps if I unmute. That's a great question. First, I think it's an example of buildings are really being taken more seriously as solutions to these issues. When 40% of the electricity generated is used in buildings, you can't have a serious, comprehensive conversation about energy or environment or sustainability if you don't have a substantial component about buildings. So I think you've seen that really come around. Secondly, I think there's an opportunity for the new administration, following up on Dan's point. The federal government, one of the biggest things they can do, in my view, is lead by example. When the federal government owns and operates more buildings and more square footage than any other sector, they can really do a lot. Excuse me. And then finally, in terms of Congress, there's an ability for Congress to really take advantage of some strong bipartisan agreement here, whether it's environmental community or workforce, and the business community has really, I think, dramatically changed in recent years because they see value for their bottom line. They see value for their brand, for their customers. And so businesses have really changed their viewpoint on this substantially. And I think there's a great opportunity, whether it's the business or environmental community or Democrats or Republicans, to really find that common ground and move this agenda with regard to buildings. So I'm very optimistic.
You just mentioned a great point, Russ, about the federal government's footprint and building footprint. So Dan, I want to bring you in here. When we're thinking about what the Biden team can do administratively, I would imagine that part of what they can do is, as Russ said, lead by example and really improve efficiency within the federal government's own buildings. I know procurement can also be a big piece of this. And I know that's something that you've done quite a bit of work on. So can you walk us through some of the potential here for how procurement could really help improve the federal government's footprint, as well as maybe spur that on into the private sector as well on building efficiency?
Well, it's a great point, Abby. It's a great point, Russ. The federal government itself, just operating its own facilities and beyond, uses on the order of about $20 billion a year in energy. Single largest energy user in the United States by far. 500,000 buildings, 300,000 vehicles, just a massive footprint, a quarter of all US land that the federal government has something to say. So there's all sorts of things. We did a major study for former then Secretary Moniz, when I was on the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, on what we call federal energy management, all of the big opportunities there, and how you could increase the use of what are called energy savings performance contracts, getting the private sector to invest in the upgrade of federal buildings and pay themselves back out of the savings. That's a very interesting and practical way to go about this. How you could reduce the federal real estate footprint. we may have too many buildings. That's one way to cut energy use, is reduce that footprint. How you could improve federal procurement of renewable energy. We do it in an awkward way, the federal government going out and seeking green electrons, and there's better ways to do it than we're doing it today. How you could increase electric vehicles, alternative fuel vehicles, all of that in the federal fleet. So there's a whole set of things that I think this incoming administration could pick up this report, could gather the expertise from a lot of very experienced federal energy managers sitting in the federal government today, and really make this a showpiece. And I think what it means is that the federal government could really become an example for the private sector. And one step beyond that is this integration between the federal government and the private sector when it comes to technology, when it comes to investment, when it comes to policy development. So I think it's a big and exciting area that does not require federal legislation. Thus, it's even more attractive.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's quite a lot of money that the government spends on energy. So I imagine they would want to try to save some if they can.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Russ, I want to bring you in here too. We just talked about some significant actions that the Biden administration can take without Congress. But what do they need Congress for? What are some things that the Biden administration might not be able to get done on building efficiency without new legislation?
Well, there's a number of things in terms of tax policy, incentives, setting some minimum standards. Those are things where Congress is uniquely set up to act, and where I think there'll be some action. So those things, some of those are market forces, some of those are incentives, and some are setting minimum standards, and all of those things together help make a difference. There's tremendous momentum in the field of sustainability that's been going on globally. Even while the US got out of the global climate accords, you've seen a number of states, a number of big city mayors or cities large and small continuing many of these goals. So this momentum has been continuing regardless of what the federal government has been doing the last 4 years. And the opportunity is that it's going to accelerate this. There's a real opportunity to accelerate it. And I think that's where, in addition to the federal government leading by example, Congress looking at some of these other tools, those are going to be the most important levers that Congress can pull.
Makes sense. And Larry, you mentioned a little earlier the infrastructure and the importance there, that can really help drive policy in the efficiency space as well. We've been promised an infrastructure week and we haven't quite gotten it yet. So, we might see that happen this year. We might see an infrastructure week or a couple weeks maybe. You mentioned a little bit about how infrastructure could impact your members. Infrastructure package could impact your members. Larry, are there specific policies or a general direction that you're hoping to see an infrastructure package take that would really move the ball forward for your members? Maybe cut costs or incentives to help spur sustainability and efficiency. Any particular policies like that are on your radar?
Yeah, actually, so when we talk about infrastructure, when the particular segment of the construction industry, excuse me, that my members work in is on the building side of it. So we talk about infrastructure, primarily what you're talking about: roads, you're talking about bridges, you're talking about rail, things like that. So you may not think that is directly related to what my members do, which is buildings. But in fact, better roads, better bridges, better rail lines take you to buildings. And so we think that, being able to dig in there is basically setting a context for what happens downstream in the construction industry. So better, more efficient construction methods. I think that the infrastructure also represents really kind of a healthier economy overall. So we, I think that's a very important aspect of that legislation, is not just having better roadways, but also the fact that, the economy is being stimulated at a time probably when it could use some real stimulation in terms of real jobs, real material needs and things like that. And but also just kind of wanted to kind of related to that is kind of referred back to something that Russ mentioned, was looking at comprehensive solutions. And actually I think this Building Action Network is a great place to have this conversation, because you're bringing together individuals, representatives from a lot of different aspects of the politics and industry and things, like to have a conversation. And hopefully we have a consistent framework or vision that we could all work within. I think that's extremely important. And just kind of the the incentives, I think that, part of inside of that vision and the framework is continuing to encourage business to look at, opportunities. I'm going to mention it before, but, it's like, what can they do without government stimulation, government funding, but in terms of a vision that will help their businesses. For example, we have large manufacturing facilities that in some cases use lighting systems that were put in place 15, 20 years ago. Some of my member companies, large manufacturers, have gone in and they've just replaced the light bulbs in their buildings and lowered their energy costs by 15%. So you take, 15% of your total energy cost of consumption and apply that to your bottom line, and their benefits. And so being able to really talk about, those opportunities for business in a, kind of the incentive way, a self-incentive. This is something that you can do yourself without any kind of additional monetary stimulation or punitive legislation, things like that. I think those are some of the things that we can continue, we should continue to be talking about, pushing out, and encouraging companies to look at. But I think the government has an opportunity through its role as the largest property owner in the country to begin taking some of those steps and then using those as examples that others can follow. So I think that, to me, that is probably one of the biggest opportunities that has really been neglected for quite a while.
You raise a great point, and I think one of the things that surprised me, and maybe it shouldn't have, but when I started covering energy, is how much money you could save by just switching a simple light bulb. I think that's maybe something that people don't realize or think about all the time because you're just used to maybe flicking on the switch and the lights being there. And as an energy reporter, I've learned that there's much more that goes on behind the scenes than that. So I want to bring Dan and Russ in on this infrastructure piece as well. Just last night, President-elect Biden sort of teased that he would be introducing in front of a joint session of Congress later in the year a Build Back Better plan that would include infrastructure. Last night he introduced his pandemic plan. So with that in mind, what are some of the things that you see building policy-wise that could fit with an infrastructure bill that also would have a recovery impact as well when we're thinking about where the economy is? And Dan, I'll start with you, and then Russ, let's hear your thoughts on that after. Dan, I think you are muted.
We had dogs barking in the background, so I muted myself.
No problem.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot that can go into that, lot that will go into a Build Back Better plan. Obviously, more funding is the place to start. There's a lot we can do there. We've talked about incentives, both new incentives, extending energy efficiency incentives. I would note, just in the consolidated appropriations bill that President Trump signed, just before the new year, there was a new tax incentive for high energy efficient commercial buildings. That is a very attractive incentive. DOE's got to do some work to implement it, but it's a good example of what you can do. I would note that one of the things that we really need to put back into gear, really need a push to get more active again on our energy efficiency standards. The Trump administration has fallen down on that job. There's on the order of 25 or so standards that should have been reviewed, should have been updated, and we are falling behind when it comes to that. This combination of incentives on the one hand and standards on the other, they work together very, very well. So as the new president considers Build Back Better, putting some stronger incentives in place, but also making sure that the standards are there to drive this. That's the really exciting package that I think could take us from where we haven't gone for the last 4 years on energy efficiency, and drive us forward to where we really need to be going.
Definitely. And Russ, would love to hear your thoughts on that as well, what you're watching out for on infrastructure.
Yeah, in fact, I would refer people for some detail on to our website where we have recommendations for the new Congress document on there. And I'll just tick off a couple of those things. And one, to be sure that there's an equity component to this, to be sure that the benefits of these improvements are more broadly shared. There's a really important workforce piece of this in terms of training. And we all know the job creation component of this in infrastructure or recovery legislation is substantial. To be sure we address resiliency issues around disaster relief, where we spend enormous amounts of money, but we could do some investment beforehand. Energy efficiency retrofits that are already included in many of these proposals. We already mentioned the federal government's leading by example, and the other important component, particularly with COVID, is a component for healthier buildings. So those are a number of the issues that are on the table where these policies can really work together to grow the economy, make it more sustainable, and have buildings be more healthy. So it's a big opportunity.
Abby, let me add one more thing following up on what Russ said. I think infrastructure, as I think all of us are pointing out, really is one of our better, more likely opportunities in the new Congress. The problem with it is that everybody wants to put everything on infrastructure. We start with roads and bridges, but we're making the case about infrastructure from so many different parts of the business world, parts of the broader society. And so I think we really have to hone the arguments around why the sorts of things we're talking about when it comes to buildings, when it comes to building infrastructure efficiency, why those really do fit well in an infrastructure package. I think they do, but I think that's going to be the challenge, because everybody sees this as a more likely to go piece of legislation than almost anything else in Washington, D.C. So let me put that on the table as a.
I second that. And as I said earlier, if folks are serious about infrastructure and regrowing the economy, there has to be a substantial piece for buildings in there. And it has such a dramatic multiplier effect because you generally have local workers and local companies, and it has a much more significant impact than a lot of other spending that could be done.
Yeah, I think, oh, go ahead, Larry, please.
If I may just kind of throw in a wild card here too, is just kind of mention use 4 numbers in a row that everybody will have a reaction to, and that's 2020. I think that there have been some changes as a result of 2020 that will at least impact everybody in the medium term. We talk about commercial buildings, we talk about offices and things like that, when in fact the many workers in the United States are not only just now working remotely, but have developed routines, and companies are increasingly comfortable with employees not being in the workplace and instead working from home. And I don't think that we've really understood what kind of impact that has had on the overall sustainability of what businesses. It's a lot more diffuse right now. So I think that in the medium term, we have to kind of be aware and maybe think about, how do we look at that, and how do we encourage the individual worker who might be not congregate in an office, but how do we encourage them to also think about being more sustainable, finding ways to, reduce their energy use.
You raise a great point, and I think it's something that a lot of companies and a lot of us are sort of grappling with in the midst of the pandemic and what our post-pandemic work life is going to look like. Is that going to be in the office 24/7, or are we going to be half from home, half from the office? I think it's something that everyone is trying to figure out, and every company is trying to figure out. And the energy implications of that, you're right, are significant, because there's been studies looking at what the energy impact is of having people at home all the time as opposed to in the office. So definitely something that will be on everyone's minds, including lawmakers. Dan, I wanted to circle back to something that you brought up, the appliance standards program at the Energy Department. We have seen the Trump administration not act on a lot of the standards within the deadlines that are set in the statute. We've also seen some sort of additional actions that they have taken that have been sort of outside the scope of what the statute requires. I'm thinking in particular maybe about rules dealing with shower heads or with toilets and dishwashers. So I'm wondering if there are any of the steps that the Trump administration has taken on the appliance standards program that should be peeled back more quickly, maybe would be eligible for a Congressional Review Act resolution that you see as particularly concerning in your view.
So the appliance standards program is, I call it the little engine that could. It's been cranking along for decades, really in a very thoughtful, intellectually driven way, in setting standards for all sorts of appliances and equipment across buildings of all sorts, residential, commercial, industrial facilities, a whole host of things. And it's saved untold amounts of energy as a result. And the Trump administration really has almost brought it to a grinding halt, and in certain ways even taken us backwards. It's adopted something called the process rule. It's complicated, but I'll simply say that it sort of covers how you go about standard setting, and it's made it more difficult rather than less difficult. So not only have they not acted on some 24 or 25 standards, recently been sued by a whole range of organizations for not acting, but they've really taken us back on the overall process that one uses. So we've really got to turn that around. And the good news is we know how to turn it around. It's a program that's been operated well, largely in a bipartisan fashion, across multiple administrations. I will tell you that in 2017, all of the assistant secretaries of energy for energy efficiency and renewable energy got together and wrote a letter to the incoming Secretary of Energy about this program. These were assistant secretaries extending back to the 1980s. All of them said this is an important program. You should move ahead with it aggressively. And unfortunately, the outgoing administration just kind of put their foot down, and we really haven't made any progress. So I think both the new energy secretary, Governor Granholm, when she's confirmed, and I think with some direction from Congress as well that might be helpful, I think we can really put this program back in gear. Whether we go through the Congressional Review Act, that's a tricky question that has all sorts of things, and I'm not going to try to address that now.
Yes, I know that CRA can get very complicated very quickly. So we're getting a lot of really great questions coming in, and I want to get to those in a second, but I want to bring up one more topic before we move to Q&A, which is electrification in buildings. And we're really seeing that as sort of a hot topic right now, and dozens of cities on the West Coast and in New England have started to put in place either restrictions on natural gas appliances in new construction, or a push toward electric appliances in terms of incentives. California, the state, is even looking at beefing up incentives for electric appliances and statewide building codes. So I want to start with you, Dan, on this one. Do you expect to see this push at the local level continue And should we expect any action from the Biden administration on building electrification?
I think we probably will see an additional push on this at the local and state level, largely because the technologies have gotten so good as a result of both private and public sector investment. What do I mean by that? Heat pumps, for example. Heat pumps used to not be something that one would really consider seriously putting in one's home, but they've gotten so good, so efficient. They really do allow us both to keep warm in the winter and to stay cool in the summer. And so I think we're beginning to see that transition. I just installed a heat pump at our home in Vermont, actually, and we're going to take some of the winter heating off of propane and putting on electricity coming from a very green grid in New England. And we're also going to add something we didn't have before, which is air conditioning. So it's a smart thing that you can do, and I do expect that the Biden administration will be looking at this whole electrification option, because it goes beyond heating and cooling. It goes to the way we cook our foods. It obviously goes to the vehicles in our garages as well in a very different way. So there's a whole host of things where we can use electricity in an efficient way and begin to reduce the carbon footprint. I will add quickly, though, that we've got to make sure that the electricity that's being used in those electrified activities is itself increasingly low carbon. Otherwise, we won't be accomplishing the goal that we really need to accomplish in the end.
Larry, I want to bring you in on this issue. As we're moving toward electric appliances and electric buildings, how does that impact your members, and what are you, does that bring concern, optimism, maybe a little bit of a mix of both? What's your view here?
Well, actually, the steel industry has underway a large-scale movement away from some of the traditional power sourcing for steel making into the electric arc furnace technologies. There's been really a major conversion already of facilities. You see some of the trends toward the construction of new facilities. They'll tend to be what we call mini mills, using brand new technology, which is extremely efficient. And so we think that that's playing a part of all of that. We think that we have an important role in that, have accepted that, and are working toward that. It's obviously it's important to take billions and billions and billions of dollars of investment in place and convert that overnight. But I think that there is definitely a commitment inside of all of the segments of the steel industry to do it cleaner, do it better, do it in a more sustainable way. I think philosophically, because it's good for the environment, it's good for employees, but it's also good for the bottom line.
And Russ, in Congress, do you think we might see some movement on electrification when it comes to buildings? Would that maybe be a sticking point that could emerge between the two parties, do you think?
It could. There's always a debate between incentives and standards or mandates. So I would expect that to fall in this kind of a evenly divided Congress, somewhere in the middle of that, with more incentives and minimum standards as opposed to mandates. But I think you're going to see that an increasingly important part of the conversation going forward. And I wanted to be sure, I wanted to follow up briefly with Dan too, because he had mentioned this, but wanted to be sure that you had a chance to talk about some of the work that the Clean Energy for Biden group did over the last year and how you see that going forward.
Yeah, so we launched Clean Energy for Biden actually on Earth Day last year with the now president-elect when he was candidate Biden, and we grew it from a couple of us to over 13,000 people who are now part of Clean Energy for Biden, and we're going to be turning that into a more permanent organization. Along the way, we provided somewhere on the order of 400 to 500 pages worth of our thoughts to the incoming administration about clean energy, climate change. Energy efficiency was a big element of those suggestions. One fun thing to note that we're going to be hosting the Green Ball the evening of Inauguration Day next week. This is the usual Green Ball that happens in person in Washington, D.C., but this is going to be the virtual Green Ball. And it's going to have some very important people speaking about our clean energy opportunities, but also we're going to have an after hours little jazz club with some big name performers, I'm told. So we'd welcome all of you to go to Clean Energy for Biden, buy a ticket, and please attend the Green Ball. But seriously, we think we've tapped into a real reservoir of interest and talent in the clean energy business community across the United States. We've had what amount to chapters in more than 40 states, people in all aspects of the clean energy industry, from people, in the construction industry, investment, policy, advocacy groups have been part of this. So we think we're onto something that we hope we can build from in this new administration and new Congress.
Right. So I want to bring in some of the great questions we're getting from our audience members here. And the first question we have is from Holly Kaufman, who says, what recommendations do you all have for mayors to ask of the Biden administration and the new Congress for buildings to help cities achieve carbon neutrality? Maybe Russ, we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, there's a really significant network of climate mayors around the country of major cities, but even small and medium-sized cities are adopting sustainability standards and goals, but they really could use some funding. There's a big issue of funding for municipalities in relief bills. I think that's going to continue to be an issue, but when they have those kind of local goals in mind, I think there'll hopefully be some national goals that they can be a part of. And so I would encourage them to first be in touch with some of the national municipal organizations that are very plugged into that, and to be a part of that conversation.
And then Larry or Dan, do either of you want to weigh in on here? If not, we can move on.
Yeah.
I'll bring in the second question, and if you have thoughts on that, then you can feel free to add them. This one I'm going to direct at Dan because it relates to something that you brought up in your remarks earlier, which is a national building standard. Dave Collins, an architect with AIA Codes and Standards, asked, what exactly would the focus be of that national building standard, and what are your expectations there?
Just to be clear, national building standards, we have.
I think what he's referring to is maybe a national standard on building efficiency, if that were an opportunity, or some sort of standards that would deal with overarching building efficiency from the national level.
So we have a mix of things. We have building energy codes that are adopted publicly and privately. We have efficiency standards for the appliances and equipment that go into buildings. It's a complicated area. We have some controversy around building codes in this country that has not been resolved. It's been something on the agenda in Congress for a while, and I think maybe what we will see is a push with the Biden administration, with the new Congress, to try to resolve some of those issues around building codes. And others on the panel may want to jump in on this as well. It's important. Other countries do establish broad codes like this. Mm-hmm. Ours has been a mix, and it's been controversial over time.
Got it. Russ or Larry, do either of you want to weigh in on that issue as well?
Well, and in terms of kind of codes and standards and things like that, I have a couple of thoughts on it. I think one of the things that happens early on when you try to set codes and try to determine the impacts is kind of the measurement of that impact, and a lot of times you have like LCA studies and other things to try to determine what the impact. I think that one of the things that would be really helpful to have would be kind of a standard approach or standard boundaries to measuring and analysis of impacts of materials, of finished products, of methods, installation processes, so that you could actually really have an apple-to-apple comparison. Right now, because of the way that some of the rules are written around LCA studies and what's permissible, you can basically define what you want your answer to be before you start the study. And I think that doesn't help decision makers get to a place where they're really making informed decisions. So I think that we try to do that. We had a project in the United Nations Environmental Program a number of years ago. Never really got enough momentum behind it, but I still think that's probably one of the things that it would be very, very important to have in place going forward. And I think again, the other thing too is kind of related to that is in terms of standards is in the spirit of really having kind of a comprehensive view, comprehensive policies. I think that when we talk about efficiencies and standards, we really need to take a comprehensive look at it. I mean, we just mentioned the equipment efficiency standards, and I mean that's a piece of it. Material efficiency standards, like related to that is the LCA, and that's a piece of it. Transportation is a piece of it. I mean, I think that so rather than I think we have to. I would encourage us all to be broad-looking and all-encompassing when we think about this, because we might fix something over here, but guess what? If it's not fixed over here, you might have a negative or no impact on the overall picture long-term. So I think comprehensive. This is again why Building Action Network is an important forum to be involved in, because you bring in so many voices from different perspectives, who are all interested in progress. So. Again, kudos to Andrew and Russ and the board of directors for this group. We're happy to be part of it.
Well, Larry, you actually brought up something that one of our attendees also brings up, which is sort of the trouble with the lack of standards for assessing a building's performance. And so this questioner also brings up that issue and says there's no standard method for capturing this information in a form that allows comparisons of where energy performance standards are achieving success. And they ask how the federal government can engage in developing these standards. Larry, starting with you, what do you see as the federal government's role here? Could the Biden administration step in to help standardize, no pun intended, these standards?
What a tremendous opportunity for the Biden administration to say, okay, we're the largest property owner in the United States. Here's the standards that we're going to measure the energy performance of our buildings, both in place, planned, and on the retrofit side of it. Here is how we're going to measure it, and that either legislatively or as an example, begins to set that framework that hopefully would be consistent, would be accurate and fair, and could be something that others could adopt.
Yeah, I would just add that I mentioned before this study that we did for Energy Secretary Moniz at the end of his tenure, at the end of the Obama administration. And chapter 1 of that big study on federal energy management was in fact on measurement, valuation, verification, all of those things. And I would encourage people to take a look at that. I do think it is a role that the federal government has taken up and could do more on. So it's a good point.
I'm gonna pile on here and say we actually, that's a great role for the federal government to set that standard for themselves, but that tends to also become the market standard. But having that common measurement, so people, know what it is, whether they're meeting it or not, or where they are. And some have even suggested an example of like in a real estate transaction where it's not mandated you meet any particular standard, but that you disclose. So the seller knows and the buyer knows, this is where the building is on the standard, and that is calculated into the market transaction. So there's some disclosure benefits from having those standards as well.
That's a great point. And it sounds like the Biden administration will have a good place to start when they start thinking about this issue. You mentioned disclosure, and I want to sort of bring in another issue around that a couple questioners have asked about, which is when it comes to infrastructure, we want to make investments in infrastructure, but any construction and any infrastructure project also can come with an extremely high, as questioners say, embodied carbon cost. So we don't want to build out infrastructure that then makes our climate and emissions problem worse. So I wanted to ask you all and get your thoughts on how we can address the carbon embodied in our building materials, in our products, in an infrastructure package. And Larry, I'll start with you here to bring in sort of the industry perspective on this. What is the importance of addressing this embodied carbon, and what would companies, your members, like to see that could really help incentivize maybe innovation or technologies that could help reduce the carbon that's baked into our materials?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think that probably what would really be useful would be to have kind of a target, have those targets, and then secondly, just kind of a reminder that, especially in heavy industry, it's not so much in small manufacturing, but heavy industry where you literally have billions of dollars in sunk investment in material, is that if there be some support, I don't know if it's tax breaks or incentives or something like that, to help with the investment that is required in some cases to be able to take that next step forward. I think that we have some proposed regulations that set a much higher, very aggressive energy standards, and you have industries where from the outside they may be perceived as having deep pockets, but in fact don't. It's kind of creating a trap, and so just have to be kind of mindful of that there is that sustainability in some cases isn't free, and so we just have to, especially I think it's something especially be kind of careful and mindful of in 2021 and 2022. We just we've just been through a very remarkable year, and while I think a lot of industries have fared better than everybody thought they might in the second quarter of last year, we don't know what kind of ripples are going to flow out of 2020 into this year and into next year. So I think that I think a common shared vision, a clear goal and path to get there, they're all essential, but that everybody should be part of that conversation.
Point. And Russ and Dan, I want to bring you both in here quickly, and I know we're getting close to the end of our hour, so I'm going to have both of you quickly give some thoughts on that, and then I'm going to use moderator's privilege to ask one quick wrap-up question, and then I'll send it back over Russ's way to close out. So Russ, I'll start with you on your thoughts on the embodied carbon piece here.
Yeah, it's really related to our prior conversation about the performance standards. That should be part of the measurement. And I know there's some folks in the academic and the scientific and industry world that are very far down the road on that, where there could be a tool deployed to do that. And there's other things, and I'm reminded of the federal and state historic tax credits, where there's that incentive to preserve a historic building because of its value, not necessarily because of the embodied carbon, but of course that's part of it, because of the difference in the cost. So it could be cheaper to go tear the building down and build a new one, but they set that value on the historic building. And so there's things like that also could be done to incentivize that, but to recognize that value as people are making those economic decisions.
And Dan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just very quickly, the first cousin of embodied carbon is, of course, the equipment that goes into all of this construction. So that takes me back to my favorite topic of these energy efficiency standards: the pumps, the motors, the lighting, all the kind of standard big energy intensive stuff that we use when we go to build infrastructure. That's the other piece of this, and we've got to stay on top of that, those efficiency standards. Make sure they're updated to reflect improvements in the underlying technology. And so if we do that, if we get serious about embodied energy, put all these pieces together, I think we will lead to investment in infrastructure, hopefully banked by the federal government, that gets us a more energy efficient and lower carbon set of improvements to overall US infrastructure.
Great. Well, I'm going to take a second to ask just a couple lightning round questions. Now, there are rules with these questions. You have to answer in 5 words or less. I know that can be tricky when we're talking about complicated policy issues, but I know you're up to the challenge. So I've got 3 of them. The first one is all electric buildings. How soon until we see them widespread? 5 years, 10, 15, 20? So Dan, I'll start with you. 5 words or less. I'm going to go down the line as I see you. So Dan, then Russ, then Larry.
Substantial uptake in 5 years.
Perfect. Russ?
I was going to say 5 as well.
For agreement. Larry?
And I'm going to hedge my bet a little bit because it depends on where you are in the country. So I'll say 10 years.
All right. All right. It's a little more than 5 words, but I'll let it slide. All right. So second one, we're going to go bottom up from how I see you on my screen, which is starting with Larry here. This one requires you to bring out your crystal ball. What is the first major sustainable buildings policy we're likely to see advance, either in Congress or by the Biden administration this year?
I think probably some baseline energy efficiency.
Great. Russ?
I'm going to say leading by example with procurement.
Okay. Dan?
Probably no surprise for me. Energy efficiency standards getting back in gear.
Got it. Got it. All right. Last one is a fun one. They're all fun, but this is a fun one too, I think. Since we're talking about buildings where we all live and work every day, we're obviously in the middle of a quarantine pandemic, and we've spent a lot of time at our homes, maybe more than we thought we would last year. So have any of you done any home improvement projects over quarantine? And Dan, I'll start with you because you did mention one that you've been working on.
Yeah, I'm very excited. We are going to have, I think, the first set of Tesla solar shingles on a house in northern New England very soon. They're going to put the underlayment down in November and install these things that both give you electricity and give you a roof, all in one package in January.
Awesome. Russ, what about you?
Nothing as sexy as that. We did some minor weatherproofing for the winter time, but
that's very important, Russ.
It is very important. Larry, close us off. Any home improvement projects in yours?
Yep, we installed a furnace with a higher SEER rating and replaced some windows that are more thermally efficient.
Wow.
Amazing. Well, you all have been very productive this quarantine. I haven't done any home improvement projects, but I also live in an apartment, so it's a little hard for me. Anyways, I will turn it back over to Russ. Thank you all so much for taking the time, and thank you to our attendees for some phenomenal questions. And Russ, you can close this out.
Great. Abby, thank you so much for your energy and your knowledge and your enthusiasm on these issues, and to our panelists for really giving some tremendous insight. I just want to close with a big thank you. Check out buildingaction.org for our 2020 first annual report. It has a great overview of the engagement we have with many members of Congress from both sides of the Congress. Also check out the recommendations to the new Congress that we put out, and look for more programming throughout this year. We think there's some tremendous opportunities with infrastructure and economic relief to have buildings be a substantial part of those conversations and to be really part of transforming America's buildings. So thank you all for being a part of this, and we look forward to connecting with you further in this new year. Take care.